Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space. Hope you enjoy. I Can Do This, written by Lager CZE. Sahari watched, standing beside the general, as the humans entered their encampment. Part of her wondered why they were permitted to do so at all. They were frail creatures, not suited for the heat of combat. They lacked the speed and precision of her own kind, the resilient nature of the dwarves, and the cunning that came so naturally to the ratlings. Even the sheer ferocity of oxmen, humans, were weak. This was no place for them. And yet, here they were, accepted among the ranks. The general could scarcely afford to be picky now. Mere days before the battle that would decide all of their fates would take place. He humored the offer these humans had made them. A mere 60 men and women, some already with grey in their hair, while others were barely old enough to be called children. They bore no swords or bows and rode no steeds, carrying with them nothing but one ragged banner, a watchful crimson eye shining on a deep blue background. They didn't even march, though they centered themselves around their banner. It was obvious these were no soldiers. The wary glances some of the young ones gave to the few warriors they gathered to observe their entrance spoke volumes. There was a fear in their expressions and body language, coupled with awe and marvel at the size of the army around them. Young looked to their elders for comforting words, their uncertainty radiating for all to see. Sahali's own expression hardened as she glanced over the camp, seeing the countless soldiers who would rush into battle without fear the next day. Thousands joined this mad endeavor, the last real attempt at turning the tide against the undead legions. It would not be easy, not by a long shot, but they were ready. 18,000 elves, 12,000 dwarves, and almost as many oxmen and ratlings. The biggest force amassed in over 500 years since the Alak the Great laid siege to the Carthai. She sighed. Who cared for a few misplaced humans? They had a battle to plan. The men were ready, the plan was in motion, and the fighting had begun. Captain Sahari looked over her shoulder, watching the 100 she was assigned steady themselves for what was to come in the cold night. They were the best of the best, veterans against the undead and the living alike, with enough war to their names to warrant a dozen battle ballads to each of their names. From across the races, she'd handpicked those brave and bold enough to lead this mad charge, as had 16 other captains. Together, they would spring an ambush worthy of elven tacticians from before the fall. Her group was laying on the edge of what would soon become a battlefield, using a terrain depression for cover. If everything went well, the main battle line would falter and begin a hasty retreat, baiting the undead into pressing them and placing themselves between the scattered flankers. In just a couple short minutes, her unit would be one of the many to assault the enemy's backlines in hopes of shattering them before they could regroup. It was a bold plan, a gamble, but it was the best chance for this world as she knew it. She turned her look in the battle's direction. The flames were getting closer, as was the noise. With every passing moment, she felt less like a bat in the night and more like a watchful hawk in a broad daylight. The light unsettled her. If they were spotted, if they lost the element of surprise, the enemy would simply annihilate them all before the main force could turn around. The faces of her men remained unwavering through it all. Sahari knew far too well that they were having the same doubts that burdened her, but not one dared to show them. Instead, they all watched the battle unfold, waiting for their signal, waiting for the moment that would shape their place in history. She put one of her pointed ears to the ground, listening distractedly to the tremors caused by thousands of warriors in full plate. Their moment was approaching. Her imagination ran wild, throwing around pictures of both glorious victory and bloody death, fueled by the faces of her men. Of these grizzled veterans, dying with blades ran through them and arrows in their back, that dwarven berserker decapitated in one foul blow, that rattling bleeding out amidst the advancing enemy, that human... Sahari did a double take, A sole human girl was curled up near the edge of the group, hands gripping tightly on a metal rod the captain could only assume to be her weapon. She was far too young to be here, unprotected by armor and petrified by fear. With a mixture of curiosity and anger, she moved towards the girl, staying low to avoid being seen. The heavy boots she wore kicked up pieces of dirt with every step, eliciting looks from the men she led, but the captain cared nothing for their stares. She dropped on her stomach next to the little girl, a stone-cold expression on her face. This child was not supposed to be with them. Propping herself up in one hand, she grabbed the girl by the shoulder, prompting her to finally notice the armored elf next to her. Sahali found the human to be quite odd, if not too dissimilar from an elf. Her features were soft for a human, a rounder face than most, and definitely more round than that of any elf, framed by light brown hair tied into a braid, though the dirt and mud had taken a toll on the color. The girl's tiny nose snapped between two steel blue, fear-stricken eyes, accompanied by worried wrinkles drawn across her forehead. She was terrified. That much was clear. Her slim figure was clad in deep blue robes with crimson lining, surprisingly reinforced by careful concealment-studded leather in several places. Years of military life made the captain to appreciate the subtlety of which it protected all the places that mattered. It was far from sufficient, especially on a real battlefield, but it must have given the wearer some semblance of comfort. However, she could not find a single weapon besides the odd metal rod in the girl's hands. It was quite the curious item, from top to bottom, covered in runes and intricate decorations, obviously not made for slashing, but for causing blunt force trauma. The weapon almost seemed ceremonial. Foolish humans. They did not understand that war was not about looking pretty. "What are you doing here?" she hissed at the human in a tone slightly sterner than might have been appropriate for someone of the girl's age. Through her anger, she hadn't noticed the girl shivered at her words and blinked in fear. Her lips parted as she tried to answer. I... The girl's voice failed her and she closed her mouth, unable to tear her eyes from the scarred elven captain and the armored hand that was holding her shoulder just a little too tightly. She seemed to shrink under Sahali's glare, almost as if she was hoping to disappear. "What are you doing here?" the elf repeated, noticeably less furiously. There was no response as the human refused to face her, turning her eyes to the ground instead. "Well," she insisted, shaking her to reinforce the point. They sent me to help," the girl managed. There was a moment of silence while Sahali considered the sheer madness of those words, followed by a stream of rushed half sentences from the girl. I can help. We were sent here to make sure that you can win. I can do this." Her rambling went on for almost a minute before the human took a sharp breath, steadying herself somewhat, and started all over, all under the elf's watchful and increasingly agitated gaze. "I'm Margaret, apprentice to..." Sahali raised a hand to stop her, and she watched as the elf carefully peeked over the edge of the little trench that they were hiding in, then looked back down at her. In a tone that begged exactly 0 questions, the captain spoke the only 2 words that could solve anything at the moment. "Stay down." She turned away from the girl, watching as the undead surged past them and gave chase to the retreating army. All that was left now was to give the signal and spring the trap. Any moment now. Sahali's hand almost instinctively found its way above her head, frozen in anticipation of the signal that she was about to give. The horde of undead in front of them kept moving, unaware of their presence for now. Only a few more seconds until the heavier, more resilient armored corpses passed them. Then she turned and locked eyes with her second-in-command, a bearded, stout dwarf. He gave her a clear, heavy nod. Her hand flew forward in a universal signal, and though her thoughts weren't focused on saying the word, she could hear her own voice screaming at the top of her lungs, "Charge!" And with that, they all leapt over the edge, up and forward into the fray. The air grew full of battle cries, some prayers to God, some promises of blood, and yet more simply loud roars of rage and hatred. Sahali savored the moment, rushing forward, wind blowing into her face and the familiar weight of her own blade comfortably in her grip. To her right, She could see those of her men who carried shields raise them to cover their faces, and accelerated even further. It was madness, bloodthirsty fury taking her, and she didn't even care. They crashed into the horde of undead. It was a sight to behold, 100 against thousands, yet the wedge of living cut through the dead like a knife might cut through butter. But not one undead in their way was left standing. Some fell by blades, and others simply thrown to the ground, still thrashing around uselessly. There wasn't a warrior who hadn't bloodied their blade in the first few seconds. Sahadi placed herself at the tip of their charge, leading as an example to all. No undead could match the prowess of a skilled swordsman, much less an elf in their prime. Her own blade buried into one walking corpse after another, severing limbs and tearing into rotting flesh, turning away the occasional retaliatory blow with a kind of practice few could claim to possess. The dead tried to claw at her, launch themselves at her, even bite, but always she had one step ahead, gracefully dodging and weaving her way through the horde. With every move, her ears were rewarded with the sound of either metal against metal or ripping flesh. And yet, another corpse was returned to its rest. But there was another to take its place. They fought, everyone under her command, with the strength of a mountain bear's and bravery shared only by the heroes of old legends. But even then, Sahari lost count of the undead she felled today. She knew that it would not be enough. It would never be enough. Another corpse swung at her in a wide arc, its sword splitting the air, thick with the smell of blood. She blocked with so much as a flick of the wrist, forcing the weapon aside, then followed up with a low slash that nearly cut the cursed monster in half. A second later, she had already freed her weapon and jammed it through another, using the body to knock away the incoming attackers. She spun on her heel, trusting the steel to cut the torn armor hanging around the next undead's neck. It bit through with a satisfying crunch and sent the creature down to the ground, followed shortly by another Sahari cut the sword arm off of. The field ran slick with blood of her enemies, and it still wasn't enough. She could see the first of her troops overwhelmed, the dwarf in heavy armor swinging his mace left and right in an futile attempt to keep some of the undead away, while he took one blow after another on his shield. His expression spelled resolve, but it wouldn't be enough. Not now, not ever. Sahari screamed something, not even she was sure what, when the man finally disappeared under the avalanche of the undead. With a newfound fury, she threw herself at the enemy. She fought with the ferocity of a cornered animal, caring not for her own safety. All that mattered now was bloodshed and rage. She turned away another assault, sliding her own weapon down the hilt of the corpse's own, then slashing across its chest. But even then, her eyes were already on another, and then her blade was through its gut, and she had to kick the next one away before she could swing at its neck and decapitate it. But there were more, so many more. Then something hit her leg and she fell, still swinging away at the monsters that surrounded her. Deep down, she knew it was it, that now she would die. Still, she turned away the blows that were aimed at her head, giving it her all until the very last moment. The blade fell. She watched it draw close. Only something happened instead. It was no more than a flash of blue light, but the pain she anticipated didn't come. The blade and the undead that bore it were gone, flying off to the side like an invisible bull had tackled it. Sahari could only gape at the empty space that housed her death just a moment ago, frozen in surprise. Then another blue something hit the undead next to it. It fell over, landing motionless in the mud. Then another, and another. The captain scampered backwards, gripping her sword tightly. She was utterly confused. The company had no archers with them. It couldn't have been any of hers. So who was it that saved her life? And what in the hell was the blue light? It was all so strange, it boggled her mind. High on adrenaline, as she already was, the rational, more careful part of her mind told her that whatever it was should be as far away as possible. But her only immediate reaction was the kind she couldn't fight. She glanced to the left, back towards the trench they came out of, only to gawk in surprise. A small, unimpressive, human girl clad in blue and crimson robes stood there, holding the ornate metal rod in her hands. But it wasn't the same terrified little thing that she told to stay down. She was no longer shaking, and the only thing left in those blue eyes of hers was steel. More interestingly, both ends of the weird metal thing she carried into battle, the same one Sahari had deemed useless earlier, were now glowing with blue light, no less. The elf had to blink away the light, only to realize that it wasn't the weapon that was glowing, but rather the symbols on it. She watched, petrified, as the girl moved her weapon back and forth, and bolts of pure blue light streaked to the end of each swing. The bolts moved almost faster than the eye could see, felling out dead in droves and never once missing. She could see the girl purse her lips and direct the deadly projectiles to those undead that threatened to get close to her, focusing solely on keeping the captain alive, only to turn away in less than 10 heartbeats and place a perfect shot over a dwarven warrior's head, saving him from an untimely end at the hands of the undead. It was unbelievable. Sahali was certain she did not believe her own eyes, and yet here she was, saved from death by a human girl wielding a weapon her mind could not hope to understand. It was too amazing to be true. No, she had to be dreaming, dazed from having a sword run through her guts, and this was a final fantasy her own mind comforted itself with before she would die. As if to bring her from her mistake, the girl suddenly stopped throwing around light and turned to clasp her hands together. Only she did not, instead seemingly wrestling with some incredible force pushing back against her. A small light formed out the thin air right in the middle, then grew and grew into the size of an apple, then the size of a man's head, then grew some more. With an unintelligible shout and visible effort, the human released the ball, somehow throwing it into the mass of undead. It soared through the air, flaming as it went over the heads. Sahali felt hot air against her face when it came nearest in its path. And then it landed, somewhere far into the undead, and the elf felt heat again as she watched it explode. Flames erupted in the place of the ball, so hot they seared the corpses around, and so intense they burned away the grass below in an instant. Those undead too close to be lost simply disappeared, while others were torn to shreds and more yet thrown aside like rag dolls. It was a simply magnificent sight. So much power packed into so little space. Sahari couldn't help but gawk, first at the explosion, then at the girl. Before her eyes, the girl fell to one knee, signs of exertion strewn across her face. She was panting, holding on to whatever that weapon of hers was for support, strength obviously depleted by whatever she had done. Her hair fell into her face, obscuring her expression. It seemed as if she was about to collapse at any moment. The captain instincts kicked back in just then, forcing her back to her feet and into a fighting stance. Her own body ached, but she didn't care. Somehow that little human girl gave her hope that whatever force she commanded would turn the tide. "Back!" she yelled, voice booming. "Shield wall, protect that human!" It was a foolish move, one that gambled everything on whatever it was the human had done. But it was the only thing Sahali could think of, and she was sure so did all the warriors under her command were aware of that. Yet they all obeyed orders, retreating step by step, falling into formation. Her people knew the risks when they chose to accompany her into battle, and they would not waver now. She found herself shoulder to shoulder with 2 Oxmen, letting them swing their massive greatswords and only stabbing whenever a lucky enemy made it too close. They inched away from the undead, inching forward until the remaining living, diminished but unbroken, were left in a rough half circle around the dark-haired girl. Sahali risked a glance behind at the opportune moment, witnessing the human somehow discard all of her fatigue to rise to her feet again, slowly but steadily. The breeze had removed offending hair from her face, giving the elf a clear view of her expression. Surprise at first, then quickly determination. She could swear at that moment the girl muttered something that was awfully close to, "I can do this." A moment later, a loud boom and a strong shockwave rocked her on her feet, throwing everyone in the formation off balance. Yet that was nothing compared to the undead ahead, who had thrown back with the force of the horse at full speed, kicked into the air like dust on a windy day. Even those too far away recoiled at the blast, stopping in their tracks. A silent moment engulfed them all, interrupted only by a clatter of those undead still trying to get back on their feet. Sahari could not believe her senses, overwhelmed by sheer destruction a singular human had caused. She stood there, rooted into the ground, frozen by fear and awe in equal measure. Just then, a hand landed on her shoulder. It should have been impossible to know whose it was, but deep down, the captain knew exactly who she was making space for when she stepped aside, creating a small hole in their line. The girl brushed past her, carrying the metal rod in her hand. There wasn't any sign of battle on her, save for the dirt in her hair and the mud on her clothes. Yet even through all of that, the human shone with an aura of power, grinning like a madwoman. "I can do this," gleefully announced Margaret, apprentice battle mage to the Watcher's Peak Mage Circle, as her eyes lit up with a blue glow of pure mana. End of story. I would just quickly like to thank the T5 channel members and patrons: Caspar Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, Parky, It's Difficult to Pronounce, Lord Azrakul, and Arcadian.